The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight deck of the Akagi as Admiral Chuichi Nagumo watched his pilots prepare for what he believed would be another glorious victory. It was June 4th, 1942, and the Imperial Japanese Navy had not tasted defeat since Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. The Pacific Ocean had become their personal highway to conquest, with Wake Island, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies falling like dominoes before their unstoppable advance. Nagumo stood with his hands clasped behind his back, the morning breeze carrying the salt spray across his weathered face. His confidence was absolute. How could it not be? The combined fleet under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had orchestrated the most devastating surprise attack in naval history, crippling the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Since then, every engagement had ended in Japanese victory, every plan executed with precision that would make a Swiss clockmaker weep with envy. The 4 aircraft carriers of the 1st Air Fleet Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and here represented the finest naval aviation force ever assembled. Their veteran pilots, hardened by years of combat in China and months of Pacific warfare, were considered invincible. These men had sunk the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse, had devastated Darwin, Australia, and had driven the Royal Navy from the Indian Ocean in complete humiliation. According to naval historian Gordon Prange's extensive research in Miracle at Midway, the Japanese carrier pilots entering the battle possessed an average of 800 hours of flight time compared to the Americans' 300. Captain Minoru Genda, the brilliant air operations officer who had helped plan Pearl Harbor, moved between the aircraft with practiced ease. His pilots called him Madman Genda for his innovative tactics, but there was nothing mad about his methodical preparation. Every detail had been considered, every contingency planned. The operation against Midway atoll would be swift and decisive, a knockout blow that would force the Americans to negotiate peace on Japanese terms. The intelligence reports painted a picture of American weakness. The enemy carriers were supposedly scattered across the Pacific, with the Yorktown heavily damaged and the Lexington already sent to the bottom. At the Battle of the Coral Sea, even if Admiral Chester Nimitz could scrape together a response, it would be too little, too late. The Japanese would seize Midway, establish an impregnable base, and threaten Hawaii itself. Nagumo's staff officers moved with quiet efficiency round the bridge, their faces betraying no doubt. Why should they? The mathematics of naval warfare seemed to favor them overwhelmingly, for heavy carriers against perhaps 2 American flat-tops, veteran pilots against green rookies, superior aircraft against obsolete American planes. The Zero fighter had established complete air superiority wherever it appeared, while the K torpedo bomber and Valdive bomber had proven devastatingly effective against enemy shipping. As the sun climbed higher, Nagumo felt the familiar surge of anticipation that preceded battle. The American Pacific Fleet would learn what the British had discovered at Ceylon, that Japanese naval aviation was a force of nature, unstoppable and merciless. By sunset, Midway would be under the rising sun flag, and the path to Hawaii would be clear. The pre-dawn darkness of June 4, 1942, concealed deadly secrets beneath the Pacific swells, while Admiral Nagumo's carriers approached Midway with supreme confidence. They sailed unknowingly into the most carefully laid trap in naval history. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from his underground headquarters at Pearl Harbor, possessed something the Japanese believed impossible: complete knowledge of their battle plans. Station Hypo, the Navy's code-breaking unit, under Commander Joseph Rockford, had achieved the impossible by cracking the Japanese naval code JN-25. Every detail of Operation Me, the assault on Midway, had been intercepted and decoded. Nimitz knew the exact composition of the Japanese fleet, their approach routes, and their timing. What the Japanese saw as their greatest strength, numerical superiority, and the element of surprise, had been transformed into their greatest weakness. The American response was a masterpiece of deception and desperate courage. Despite having only 3 operational carriers against 4 Japanese flat-tops, Nimitz positioned his forces with surgical precision. Task Force 16, commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, included the carriers Enterprise and Hornet. Task Force 17, under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, centered on the hastily repaired Yorktown, which the Japanese intelligence services believed had been sunk at Coral Sea. At 0 for 30 hours, the first phase of the Japanese plan unfolded exactly as predicted. 108 aircraft launched from the four carriers to attack Midway's airfields and installations. The assault was devastating. Hangars erupted in flames, fuel dumps exploded, and the tiny garrison fought desperately against overwhelming odds. But the attack served American purposes perfectly, drawing the Japanese into a deadly game of misdirection. The Midway-based aircraft, though obsolete and outclassed, launched everything that could fly: ancient Brewster Buffalo fighters, Douglas, Dauntless dive bombers, and Martin Marauder medium bombers attacked the Japanese fleet in waves. These brave pilots, flying inferior aircraft against the world's finest naval aviation, suffered horrific casualties. The Torpedo Squadron 8 detachment, flying slow TBF Avengers, was completely wiped out. Yet their sacrifice bought precious time and forced the Japanese to maintain combat air patrol over their own fleet. Naval historian Walter Lord documented in incredible victory that the American losses during these initial attacks were staggering. Over 60% of the attacking aircraft were shot down. The crucial moment came when Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, leading the Midway Strike Force, radioed back to the Hiryu at 0700 hours. There is need for a second attack wave. These 8 words would prove catastrophic for the Japanese. Admiral Nagumo, believing the American carriers were still hundreds of miles away, made the fateful decision to rearm his reserve aircraft with land attack bombs instead of the armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes needed for anti-ship warfare. As Japanese flight crews worked frantically to switch ordnance, the trap began to close. The American carriers, positioned northeast of Midway, had been launching their own strike forces since dawn. The obsolete torpedo bombers would arrive first, flying low and slow directly into the teeth of the Japanese air defense. Behind them, unseen and undetected, the dive bombers climbed toward their attack altitude. The morning sun, that had seemed so auspicious to Admiral Nagumo, now illuminated the approach of Nemesis. The Japanese had won every battle by striking first and striking hard. But at Midway, they would learn that in warfare, the hunter can become the hunted in a single moment of tactical miscalculation. The morning of June 4, 1942, would witness acts of courage so desperate and sacrifice so complete that they would redefine heroism for generations of naval aviators. As the Japanese fleet steamed in perfect formation toward Midway, confident in their invincibility, the first wave of American attackers approached their target with grim determination. An obsolete aircraft, Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, flew directly into the teeth of the Japanese air defenses. Waldron, a part Cherokee pilot from South Dakota, had trained his men relentlessly for this moment. His squadron of 15 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers aircraft, already obsolete when the war began, carried the hopes of a desperate nation and the weight of certain death. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, composed of deadly Mitsubishi Zero fighters, fell upon the torpedo bombers like wolves on sheep. The Devastators, flying at wave-top level at a sluggish 110 knots, were sitting ducks for the nimble Zeros. One by one, Waldron's aircraft were shot down in flames. The torpedo bombers' defensive armament, a single .30 caliber machine gun operated by the rear gunner, proved pathetically inadequate against the Zero's cannon and machine guns. Lieutenant George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, watched in horror as his squadron mates died around him. His own aircraft, riddled with bullets and leaking fuel, finally crashed into the Pacific just short of the Japanese fleet. Gay floated in the water, hidden beneath a rubber seat cushion as the battle raged overhead. His sacrifice and that of his 14 squadron mates would not be in vain. They had drawn the Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches UNDEFENDED. Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise, commanded by Lieutenant Eugene Lindsay, met a similar fate. Lindsay's 14 aircraft approached the Japanese fleet from a different angle, hoping to catch them in a coordinated attack with the dive bombers, but the timing was wrong. The coordination failed, and the devastators flew alone into the murderous fire of the Japanese fleet. Only 4 aircraft survived the attack, and none of their torpedoes found their mark. According to Samuel Eliot Morrison's official Navy history, the Two-Ocean War, the American torpedo attacks achieved a hit rate of 0%, while suffering casualties of over 90%. The final torpedo attack came from Torpedo Squadron 3 off the Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey. These 12 aircraft, approaching from yet another angle, faced the same hopeless odds as their predecessors. The Japanese fleet, now fully alert and with their combat air patrol reinforced, met them with devastating fire. Massey's own aircraft was among the first to fall, the commander dying at the controls as his bomber plunged into the sea. But the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons, though it appeared futile, was achieving something crucial. The Japanese fighters, veterans of countless air battles, were burning fuel and ammunition in their low-level pursuit of the American torpedo bombers. More importantly, they were out of position for what was coming next. Ensign George Gay, floating in the water amid the wreckage of his squadron, watched the Japanese carriers maneuvering frantically. To avoid the torpedo attacks, the flight decks were cluttered with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. Fuel lines snaked across the decks, and ordnance was stacked in the open air. The Japanese, supremely confident in their air defense, had not bothered to clear their decks for action. The morning sun, which had risen on Japanese confidence, now illuminated a scene of desperate American courage. 41 torpedo bombers had attacked the Japanese fleet. Only 6 returned. 35 aircraft and their crews had been sacrificed on the altar of duty, flying obsolete planes in a hopeless mission. Their deaths seemed meaningless, their sacrifice futile, but in the sky above, unseen by the Japanese fighters circling at wave-top level, the dive bombers were beginning their approach. The torpedo squadrons had bought their dive bomber comrades the most precious gift in aerial warfare: surprise. The slaughter of the torpedo squadrons was about to be transformed into the salvation of the American fleet. At 10:24 in the morning of June 4, 1942, the Pacific War balanced on a knife's edge. The Japanese fleet, having brushed aside the American torpedo attacks with contemptuous ease, began preparing for their own decisive strike. On the flight decks of the 4 carriers, aircraft were being hastily rearmed with anti-ship weapons as reports confirmed the presence of American carriers to the northeast. Admiral Nagumo's flagship Akagi presented a scene of organized chaos. Flight crews worked frantically to switch ordnance loads while maintaining the combat air patrol that had just devastated the American torpedo squadrons. The deck was cluttered with fuel lines, ammunition, and aircraft in various stages of preparation. Similar scenes played out on the Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the cream of the Japanese carrier force operating with the casual efficiency of veterans who had never known defeat. High above the scene, invisible to the Japanese lookouts scanning the horizon, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led 37 Douglas SPD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise. McCluskey, a former fighter pilot turned bomber squadron commander, had made a crucial decision that would alter the course of the war. When his initial search had failed to locate the Japanese fleet, he had gambled on extending his flight path, burning precious fuel in a desperate hunt for the enemy. The gamble paid off when McCluskey spotted the Japanese destroyer Arashi steaming at high speed toward the main fleet. The destroyer, which had been attacking the submarine Nautilus, unwittingly provided a navigation beacon that led the American dive bombers directly to their target. At 10:22, McCluskey's pilots spotted the 4 Japanese carriers spread across the ocean like a deadly constellation. Naval historian Gordon Prange noted in Miracle at Midway that McCluskey's decision to extend his search used so much fuel that several aircraft would later ditch in the ocean short of their carriers. The sight that greeted the American dive bombers was everything a naval aviator could hope for. The Japanese carriers, caught in the midst of refueling and rearming operations, were completely vulnerable. their combat air patrol, having been drawn down to sea level by the torpedo attacks, was climbing desperately but would not reach attack altitude in time. The decks were crowded with aircraft, fuel, and ordnance-perfect targets for dive bombing. McCluskey split his force, leading one section against the Kaga while his second section, commanded by Lieutenant Richard Best, targeted the Akagi, the dauntless dive bombers, pushing over into their characteristic 70-degree dives, screened down through the morning air with sirens wailing. The Japanese, caught completely by surprise, could only watch in horror as their moment of triumph transformed into catastrophe. The first bomb struck the Akagi at 10:26, penetrating the flight deck and exploding among the aircraft being rearmed below. The explosion ignited aviation fuel and detonated stored ordnance, turning the flagship into a roaring inferno. Within minutes, the pride of the Japanese fleet was a blazing wreck. Her flight operations permanently ended. The Kaga suffered an even more devastating attack. Multiple bombs struck the carrier, including one that exploded directly among the aircraft spotted on the flight deck. The explosion was so massive that it lifted the carrier's island structure and bent the flight deck like a pretzel. The Kaga, veteran of Pearl Harbor and countless victories, became a funeral pyre for over 800 of her crew. Simultaneously, dive bombers from the Yorktown, under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, attacked the Soryu. 3 bombs transformed the carrier into a blazing torch. Her aviation fuel fires so intense that she had to be abandoned within 20 minutes. The Soryu, which had helped sink the Prince of Wales and terrorized the Indian Ocean, joined her sister ships in their death throes. In the span of 5 minutes from 10:24 to 10:29, the Japanese carrier force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months was effectively destroyed. 3 of the 4 carriers were burning hulks. Their aircraft and experienced pilots lost forever. The mathematical superiority that had seemed so overwhelming that morning had been transformed into a death sentence. The rising sun flag still flew over the Hiryu, but the myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered forever. The admirals, who had seen only victory, now witnessed the destruction of their dreams amid the smoke and flames of their burning carriers. The afternoon sun of June 4, 1942, cast long shadows across the Pacific as the sole surviving Japanese carrier Hiryu steamed through the smoke of her burning sister ships. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division from the Hiryu, watched the funeral pyres of the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu with a mixture of grief and determination. The man who had opposed the Pearl Harbor attack as strategically flawed now faced the consequences of that fateful decision. Yamaguchi, considered by many to be the finest carrier admiral in the Japanese Navy, refused to accept defeat. While the other carriers burned, he ordered an immediate strike against the American fleet. The Hiryu still carried enough aircraft to inflict serious damage, and her experienced pilots remained among the best in the world. If the Japanese were to salvage anything from this disaster, it would require the kind of desperate courage that had built the Empire. At 10:54 hours, 18 Nakajima B-5 and Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zero fighters launched from the Hiryu's flight deck. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led this mixed force toward the American carriers, flying aircraft that had survived the morning's catastrophe. These pilots, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids, understood that they were likely flying to their deaths. The mathematics of aerial warfare had turned against them, but they pressed forward with the fatalistic courage of the samurai. The American Combat Air Patrol, now reinforced and alert, met the Japanese attack with devastating efficiency. The obsolete American fighters Grumman F-4F Wildcats that were outclassed by the Zero in every performance category fought with desperate skill. The American pilots, many of them fresh from training, made up for their aircraft's shortcomings with superior tactics and radio coordination. Despite the fierce resistance, several Japanese aircraft penetrated the American defense. The Yorktown, Admiral Fletcher's flagship, became the primary target. 3 bombs struck the carrier, punching through her flight deck and exploding deep within her hull. The veteran carrier, hastily repaired after the Battle of the Coral Sea, shuddered under the impact. Her boilers went cold, her electrical systems failed, and she began listing to port. According to Robert Leckey's account in the Wars of America, the damage control parties aboard the Yorktown performed miracles of seamanship, restoring power and reducing the list within 2 hours. But Admiral Yamaguchi was not finished. At 13:31, he launched a second strike 10K torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros led by Lieutenant Toshio Hashimoto. This attack, composed of the Hiryu's remaining operational aircraft, represented the last throw of the dice for Japanese carrier aviation. The pilots knew they were flying a one-way mission. Even if they survived the attack, they lacked the fuel to return to their burning fleet. The second Japanese strike found the Yorktown apparently abandoned and dead in the water. The American damage control parties had temporarily restored power, but the carrier appeared to be a sitting duck. Hashimoto's torpedo bombers, attacking from multiple directions, achieved what their morning counterparts had failed to accomplish. 2 torpedoes slammed into the Yorktown's port side, flooding her engine rooms and causing a severe list that could not be corrected. The Yorktown, veteran of the Coral Sea and survivor of the morning's bomb attack, finally succumbed to her wounds. Admiral Fletcher, forced to transfer his flag to the cruiser Astoria, watched his carrier settle lower in the water. The ship that had helped win the morning's victory was now dying under the afternoon sun. But the Hiryu's moment of triumph was brief. American reconnaissance aircraft had located the last Japanese carrier, and Admiral Spruance was preparing his response. The dive bombers of the Enterprise, rearmed and refueled, were already climbing toward their attack altitude. The Hiryu had achieved a measure of revenge, but she had also revealed her position to an enemy that still possessed 2 operational carriers. At 17:03, 24 Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise found the Hiryu steaming desperately toward the northwest. The carrier, her flight deck crowded with aircraft being prepared for a third strike, presented the same vulnerable target that her sister ships had offered that morning. The American dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, pushed over into their attack dives with the precision of veteran pilots. 4 bombs struck the Hiryu in rapid succession, turning her flight deck into a blazing inferno. The carrier, that had struck the final blow against the Yorktown, now joined her sister ships in their death throes. Admiral Yamaguchi, standing on the bridge as flames consumed his flagship, chose to go down with his ship rather than accept the humiliation of rescue. The dawn of June 6, 1942, revealed a Pacific Ocean transformed by 2 days of unprecedented naval warfare. The smoke from burning Japanese carriers had dissipated, leaving behind oil slicks and debris fields that marked the graves of the finest naval aviation force ever assembled. But the Battle of Midway was not yet over. One final act of this maritime drama would play out beneath the waves. The USS Yorktown, abandoned and listing heavily to port, drifted like a wounded giant across the blue Pacific. Her crew, rescued by accompanying destroyers, watched from a distance as their ship fought for survival. The carrier's damage control parties had performed miracles, but 2 torpedo hits had proven too much for even the most skilled seamanship. Yet the Yorktown refused to sink, her watertight compartments keeping her afloat despite catastrophic flooding. Admiral Nimitz, monitoring the situation from Pearl Harbor, made a crucial decision. The Yorktown was too valuable to abandon. If she could be saved, the Pacific Fleet would retain 3 operational carriers instead of 2. The fleet tug Vireo was dispatched to take the wounded carrier in tow, while the destroyer Hammond came alongside to provide power and additional damage control assistance. The salvage operation began on June 5 with desperate efficiency. Damage control parties reboarded the Yorktown, fighting flooding and working to restore stability to the listing carrier. The Hammond, tied up alongside, provided electrical power and pumping capacity while her crew worked alongside the carriers. Sailors, in the flooded compartments below decks. For a time, it seemed that American determination might snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. But the Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, had been tracking the damaged American carrier since the previous evening. The submarine, originally part of the screening force for the Midway operation, had been ordered to locate and attack any damaged American ships. Tanabe, a veteran submarine commander, had patiently maneuvered his boat into attack position. According to Clay Blair's comprehensive submarine warfare history Silent Victory, the I-168 had been specifically tasked with attacking Midway's installations, but was diverted to hunt for damaged American ships. At 13:36 on June 6, the I-168 achieved perfect firing position. The Yorktown and Hammond, tied together and virtually motionless, presented an irresistible target. Tanabe fired for Type 95 torpedoes from a range of 1,200 yards, then took his submarine deep to avoid the inevitable depth charge attack. The first torpedo struck the Hammond directly amidships, breaking the destroyer's back and killing 81 of her crew instantly. The small warship, which had survived the morning's air attacks and faithfully served alongside the carrier, disappeared beneath the waves in less than 4 minutes. The second torpedo struck the Yorktown forward of her island structure, opening new flooding that the damage control parties could not contain. The Yorktown, veteran of the Coral Sea and hero of Midway, finally succumbed to her wounds. The carrier that had helped break the back of Japanese naval aviation rolled over and sank at dawn on June 7, 1942. Her loss was a bitter pill for the American Navy, but it could not diminish the strategic victory that had been won. The I-168's successful attack represented the final Japanese success of the Midway campaign. Lieutenant Commander Tanabe had given his nation a small measure of revenge for the disaster that had befallen the combined fleet, but it was too little. Too late. The 4 Japanese carriers lost at Midway could never be replaced, while the Americans were already building new flat-tops at an unprecedented rate. The submarine's torpedoes had claimed the last victim of the Battle of Midway, but they had also sealed the fate of the Japanese Empire. The Yorktown would be replaced by the new Essex-class carriers already under construction. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu would never sail again, and with them died Japan's hope of victory in the Pacific War. The setting sun of June 7, 1942, cast its dying light across a Pacific Ocean forever changed by 4 days of unprecedented naval warfare. In the waters northwest of Midway Atoll, the funeral pyres of the Japanese carrier fleet had finally burned themselves out, leaving only oil slicks and debris to mark the graves of the Imperial Navy's finest ships. The Battle of Midway was over, and with it died the myth of Japanese invincibility that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor and commander of the combined fleet, received the catastrophic news aboard his flagship Yamato with stoic acceptance. The man who had warned his government that Japan could run wild in the Pacific for only 6 months to a year had been proven tragically prescient. The Midway operation, designed to eliminate the American carrier force and force a negotiated peace, had instead eliminated Japan's own naval aviation and ensured a long war that the empire could not win. The mathematics of the disaster were staggering. For fleet carriers the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had been lost, along with over 300 aircraft and many of Japan's most experienced pilots. The Americans had lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown, and approximately 150 aircraft. But the strategic implications went far beyond mere numbers. Japan's shipyards, already strained by wartime production, could not quickly replace the lost carriers. More critically, the experienced aircrews who had made Japanese naval aviation so formidable were irreplaceable. The Japanese pilot training program, designed for quality over quantity, produced excellent aviators but in small numbers. The Americans, with their vast industrial capacity and training infrastructure, could replace losses much more rapidly. The Battle of Midway had not only eliminated Japan's numerical advantage in carrier aviation, it had reversed it permanently. According to historian John Keegan's analysis in the Second World War, the Battle of Midway marked the point at which American industrial capacity began to decisively influence the Pacific War. Admiral Nagumo, who had commanded the First Air Fleet through its string of victories from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, submitted his resignation in shame. The man who had once led the most powerful naval striking force in history now faced the humiliation of explaining how 4 carriers had been lost to a numerically inferior enemy. His resignation was refused. The Imperial Navy needed experienced officers, even those who had tasted defeat. The news of the disaster was carefully concealed from the Japanese public. Radio Tokyo continued to broadcast claims of victory, describing the successful occupation of Midway and the heavy losses inflicted on the American fleet. The wounded, survivors of the sunken carriers were quarantined and sworn to secrecy. The families of the dead were told only that their sons had died gloriously in battle, with no mention of the tactical disaster that had claimed their lives. But the truth could not be hidden from Japan's military leaders. The army, which had opposed the Midway operation from the beginning, quietly began preparations for a defensive strategy. The dreams of conquering Australia and Hawaii were quietly abandoned. The empire that had expanded relentlessly for 18 months suddenly found itself planning for the first time how to defend what it had already conquered. Admiral Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, understood the magnitude of his victory. The battle that had begun with desperate American attempts to defend a tiny atoll had ended with the destruction of Japanese naval supremacy. The tide of war in the Pacific had turned, though the fighting would continue for 3 more bloody years. The young Americans, who had flown obsolete aircraft into the teeth of Japanese air defenses, had achieved something their leaders had hardly dared hope for. They had won a decisive victory against overwhelming odds. The torpedo squadrons that had been slaughtered in the morning had bought the time needed for the dive bombers to deliver their knockout blow. The sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8, Torpedo Squadron 6, and Torpedo Squadron 3 had not been in vain. The sun that had risen on June 4, 1942, on Japanese confidence and American desperation now set on a transformed Pacific. The Japanese admirals, who had seen only victory until Midway, would never again taste the sweet wine of triumph. The rising sun flag, which had flown over a dozen conquered territories, would soon begin its long retreat toward the home islands. The Battle of Midway had ended, but its echoes would resonate through the remaining years of the Pacific War. The empire of the rising sun had reached its zenith and begun its decline in the same for days. The confidence that had carried Japanese arms from Pearl Harbor to the gates of Australia had been burned away in the flames of their own carriers, leaving only the bitter ashes of what might have been.